Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me.
The rumble of the mines never ceased. Day after day, Boren's stone arm stood in the midst of it all, the rhythmic pounding of hammers against stone ringing in his ears. The air was thick with the scent of metal and sweat, the weight of the earth pressing down on him from every side. It was the only life he'd ever known, a deep in the heart of the Dwarven kingdom, surrounded by tunnels that stretched endlessly into the dark. He wiped his brow with a rough hand, casting a glance toward the other miners. They were his people, his brothers and sisters. For generations, their families had worked these mines, pulling precious ores from the stone that fed the wealth of the kingdom. But for all their labor, what did they have to show for it? Scraps. The nobles above lived in grand halls, feasting on the riches that the miners' sweat provided, while down here, they worked until their hands bled. It wasn't right. And Boren was going to change that. He'd grown up hearing the tales of their ancestors, the proud history of the Dwarven kingdom, when all Dwarves nobles and workers alike had stood as one. But over the centuries, that unity had crumbled. The nobles, those born into wealth and power, had grown fat and complacent, while the workers toiled beneath them. The divide had never been greater, and Boren knew something had to give. And soon, a deep rumble echoed through the tunnel, louder than usual, and Boren felt the tremor in the soles of his boots. He paused, the hair on the back of his neck prickling. The others felt it too, glancing around nervously, their hammers momentarily still. It wasn't the typical groan of the earth settling. This was something else. One of the older miners, Grum, muttered under his breath, "The mountain's angry." Boren wasn't superstitious by nature, but he couldn't deny the uneasy feeling that had settled over the mines in recent months. Strange things had been happening in more cave-ins, equipment failures, and, according to some, ghostly whispers from the deep. He shook his head, pushing the thought aside. "Back to work," he called, his voice steady. "We've got a shift to finish." Reluctantly, the miners returned to their tasks, but the unease lingered in the air. Boren continued chipping away at the rock, but his mind was elsewhere, on the future of the kingdom. For months now, he'd been quietly organizing the workers, rallying them to demand better conditions, fair pay, and a voice in the kingdom's future. It had started small whispers in the dark, meetings held in secret, but it had grown into something more, something the nobles could no longer ignore. And now, for the first time in the history of the Dwarven kingdom, an election had been called. The workers would have their chance to choose a leader, someone to stand against the nobles and fight for their rights. Boren had never imagined he'd be that leader, but the people had chosen him. He was their voice now, and he couldn't afford to let them down. As his shift ended, Boren made his way through the maze of tunnels, his thoughts heavy. The election was only days away, and tensions in the kingdom were at an all-time high. Lord Thrain Ironshield, the noble candidate, represented everything Boren stood against: a tradition, wealth, and the rigid hierarchy that kept the workers in their place. Thrain was a formidable opponent, with the backing of the wealthiest families in the kingdom, and he would stop at nothing to maintain his hold on power. Boren stepped out into the cool underground air of the Dwarven capital. The city sprawled before him, a labyrinth of stone buildings carved into the rock, illuminated by the soft glow of molten forges. High above, the grand halls of the nobles loomed like sentinels, casting long shadows over the workers' quarters below. Boren's jaw tightened as he stared up at them. Those halls were symbols of everything wrong with the kingdom, symbols of a system that needed to change. As he made his way toward the workers' district, Boren noticed a group of his supporters gathered around a crude wooden platform, listening to a speaker. He pushed his way through the crowd, nodding to familiar faces. They were tired, worn down by years of labor, but there was a fire in their eyes that hadn't been there before. A fire he had helped ignite. The speaker was Garla, one of Boren's closest allies, a sharp-tongued miner with a quick wit and an even quicker temper. She saw Boren approaching and grinned. "Here he is, our future king of the mines," she called, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Boren raised a hand, silencing them with a smile. "I'm no king," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I'm just a miner, like all of you. But I'll tell you these, I'm not going to stand by and watch while the nobles bleed us dry. Not anymore." The crowd cheered again, and Borean felt a swell of pride. These were his people, and they were ready for change. Garla stepped down from the platform, clapping him on the shoulder. "You've got them fired up, Borean. But Thrain's not going to go down without a fight. You know that, right?" Borean nodded grimly. "I know, but we've got something he doesn't hope. And that's worth more than all the gold in the nobles' vaults." The days leading up to the election were tense. The capital buzzed with activity, as both Borean and Thrain's supporters campaigned fiercely. Posters bearing their likenesses plastered the walls of the city, and debates were held in the grand halls, where the two candidates clashed over their visions for the kingdom's future. Borean's speeches were passionate, filled with promises of a better life for the workers. He spoke of fair wages, safer conditions in the mines, and an end to the nobles' stranglehold on power. His words resonated with the workers, and his support grew with each passing day. Thrain, on the other hand, took a more conservative approach. He warned of the dangers of radical change, insisting that the kingdom's stability depended on the nobles maintaining control. He spoke of tradition, of the importance of preserving the old ways, and he painted Borean as a reckless upstart who would lead the kingdom to ruin. Despite Thrain's best efforts, Borean's momentum was undeniable. The workers had suffered too long, and they were ready for something new. But as the election drew closer, the tension in the city began to boil over. One night, as Borean was returning to his quarters after a long day of campaigning, he was ambushed in a narrow alley. 3 men, faces obscured by hoods, attacked him without warning, brandishing knives. Borean fought back, his instincts honed by years in the mines, but he was outnumbered and overpowered. Just as he thought he might not survive the encounter, a group of his supporters appeared, drawn by the commotion. They chased the attackers off, but not before Borean had taken a deep slash across his arm. "You all right?" Garla asked, rushing to his side as the attackers fled into the night. Borean gritted his teeth against the pain, nodding. "I'm fine, just a scratch." But it wasn't just a scratch. The attack was a message from Thrain or one of his supporters. The nobles were getting desperate, and they would stop at nothing to keep their hold on power. The next morning, word of the attack spread like wildfire. Borean stood before a gathering of his supporters, his arm bandaged, the wound still fresh. The sight of their leader injured only fueled the workers' anger, and they demanded justice. "They think they can scare us," Borean said, his voice steady but full of fire. "They think they can beat us into submission, like they always have, but they're wrong. We're stronger than that, stronger than they ever imagined." The crowd roared in approval, and Borean knew that, despite the danger, the attack had only solidified their resolve. But even as he stood before them, a nagging fear tugged at the back of his mind. The ancient power that lay deep beneath the mine, as he could feel it now, more clearly than ever. Something was waking, something old and dangerous, and he didn't know how long they had before it broke free. The election day dawned with a palpable tension in the air. The streets of the capital were packed with dwarves, all eager to cast their votes in what would be a historic moment for the kingdom. Borean stood among them, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment they had all fought for, the moment that would decide the future of the kingdom. But even as the ballots were cast, the ground beneath their feet trembled. It was faint at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. Borean exchanged a glance with Garla, who was standing beside him. She felt it too. "Something's not right," she muttered. Before Borean could respond, a deafening crack echoed through the streets, and the ground split open beneath them. The crowd scattered in panic as the earth trembled violently. Buildings crumbled, and the air was filled with dust and debris. Borean's heart raced as he stared at the gaping chasm that had opened in the center of the city. Deep within the darkness, he could feel the ancient power, finally awake. The chasm yawned before them, the deep rumble reverberating in Boren's bones as if the mountain itself had come alive. The workers who had stood beside him moments ago were now scattered in every direction, fleeing from the chaos. The city trembled, and Boren could hear the distant cries of those trapped beneath rubble, the screeching sound of stone grinding against stone as buildings toppled. Garla grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward the edge of the square. "Boren, we have to move." He shook his head, staring into the abyss that had opened at the heart of the capital. It wasn't just an earthquake. He could feel the presence stirring below, ancient, malevolent, and growing stronger by the second. The heart of stone had awoken. "We can't leave," he said, his voice steady despite the terror gnawing at his insides. "This is it. Whatever's down there, broken bar, it's coming for all of us." Garla's eyes widened. She'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. Whispers about the forgotten power that lay buried beneath the mines, the tales passed down from generations long gone. But rumors had turned real in the worst possible way. She let go of his arm, nodding grimly. "If that thing gets at a broken bar, the election won't matter," she muttered. Boren glanced at the people still running in panic, their fear consuming them. He knew she was right. The fight for leadership, for the future of the kingdom, all of it was meaningless if they didn't stop what was coming from beneath the earth. And deep down, he also knew they couldn't do it alone. "We need Thrain," Boren said suddenly, the realization hitting him hard. Garla stared at him as if he'd gone mad. "You can't be serious. After everything, he's the only one with access to the old records. The nobles know more about what's buried down there than we do. If there's any chance of sealing the thing back up, he'll know how to do it." Boren didn't wait for her to argue. He turned and ran, his boots pounding the broken cobblestones as he made his way toward the noble district. The city was crumbling around him, and the path was blocked in places by fallen debris, but he pressed on, weaving through the destruction. His arm throbbed from the wound he'd taken days before, but he barely noticed the pain. All that mattered now was finding Thrain and stopping the disaster they had unknowingly unleashed. The grand halls of the nobles were in chaos when Boren arrived. Servants and guards scrambled to evacuate the lavish estates as the earth trembled beneath their feet. Boren pushed through the crowd, ignoring the shocked and angry looks thrown his way. They all knew who he was by now, at the upstart miner challenging their authority, but none of that mattered anymore. He found Thrain in the central hall of his mansion, surrounded by advisors who looked more afraid of him than the destruction happening outside. The noble leader's face was pale, his usual air of confidence shaken, but he still wore the heavy robes of his station, as if clinging to tradition would somehow protect him. Boren didn't bother with pleasantries. "Thrain, we need to talk." "Now?" Thrain looked up, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Boren. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here, Stonearm." "Shut up," Boren snapped. "This isn't about the election anymore. That thing you nobles buried under the mine it's waking up. And if we don't stop it, there won't be anything left to lead." For a moment, Thrain looked as though he might order his guards to throw Boren out, but something in the miner's voice must have gotten through to him. He glanced toward the window, where the distant rumble of the chasm's tremors could still be heard. "What do you know about it?" Thrain asked, his voice tight. "Enough to know that we don't have much time," Boren replied. "You've got access to the old records, the ones that talk about the seals." "I need them." Thrain's eyes flicked toward one of his advisors, who was already shaking his head. "The records were lost long ago," the advisor stammered. "No one remembers how the seals were made." "Then we'll have to find out the hard way," Boren said, his patience running thin. "You've got two choices, Thrain. Either help me stop this thing and save your kingdom, or sit back and watch it all collapse." Thrain stood silent for a moment, his jaw clenched. Then, with a sharp nod, he gestured to his advisors. "Leave us." Now, as the others scurried out of the room, Thrain turned back to Boren. "There's something you need to see." He led Boren through the mansion, past opulent corridors lined with tapestries and statues. They descended into the lower levels, where the stone walls became rougher, older. Finally, They arrived at a small, dimly lit chamber, where an ancient map of the kingdom was spread across a stone table. "This," Thrain said, pointing to a section of the map that showed the deepest levels of the mines, "is where the heart of stone was sealed, centuries ago." Boren studied the map. The area was familiar. He'd worked near those tunnels many times, but he'd never realized just how close they had been to the ancient power. "What happened down there?" Boren asked. Thrain's expression darkened. "The heart of stone is not just an artifact, it's a being, a force that was born from the mountain itself. Our ancestors believed it was the source of the kingdom's strength, but over time, it became a broken bar too powerful. They couldn't control it. So they sealed it deep within the earth, hoping it would never wake. Until now," Boren muttered. Thrain nodded. "Until now." The seals must have weakened over time, and with all the mining, it was only a matter of time before something broke through. Boren clenched his fists. They had done these unwittingly, but still, it was their actions that had caused the seals to break, and now it was their responsibility to fix it. "How do we stop it?" Boren asked. Thrain hesitated. "I don't know if we can. The old texts speak of a ritual, but it's incomplete. We don't have the knowledge or the power that our ancestors did." Boren stared at him, disbelief and anger rising in his chest. "You're telling me we woke up an ancient power that can destroy the kingdom, and we have no way to stop it?" Thrain met his gaze, his face grim. "I'm saying we'll have to figure it out ourselves." Together. Boren's jaw tightened, but he nodded. They didn't have a choice. "Then let's go." "We don't have much time." They gathered a small group of Boren's most trusted miners and Thrain's elite guard and set out for the mines. The journey was treacherous. The tunnels that had once been stable were now crumbling, the ground beneath them shifting constantly. Boren led the way, his familiarity with the mines guiding them through the maze of collapsing passageways. As they descended deeper into the earth, the air grew colder, and the oppressive weight of the mountain pressed down on them. Boren could feel the presence of the heart of stone growing stronger, pulsing beneath the surface like a dark heartbeat. They were getting close. The final stretch of the journey took them to an ancient chamber, long forgotten by the dwarves. Massive stone doors, covered in faded runes, barred their way. "The seal." "This is it," Thrain said, his voice barely a whisper. Boren stepped forward, running his hand over the surface of the stone. He could feel the power radiating from it, the raw, primal force of the mountain itself. But something was wrong. The runes that had once held the heart of stone in place were fading, crumbling like the rest of the kingdom. "It's too weak," Boren said. "The seal's not going to hold." Thrain stepped beside him, studying the runes. "There has to be something we can do, some way to strengthen it." But even as they spoke, the ground beneath their feet shook violently, and the stone doors began to crack. The heart of stone was coming. Boren turned to the others. "We need to reinforce the seal." Now. The group sprang into action, but it was clear that they were out of time. The runes were too damaged, the power too great. As the cracks spread across the stone, Boren realized with a sinking heart that they couldn't stop it. Suddenly, the doors burst open, and the heart of stone surged forward at an immense, glowing mass of energy and stone, alive with a terrible, ancient power. It roared, and the chamber trembled, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling as the mountain itself seemed to scream in anger. Boren stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment they had all feared. The moment he had to face. He glanced at Thrain, who was already preparing his guards for battle, and then back at the heart of stone. They might not survive this. But he wasn't about to let everything they'd fought for be destroyed. With a final, determined breath, Boren raised his hammer and charged.